Hello everyone, in today's video I install the drivetrain and struts into the Firebird and take it for a test drive, and I show the design process I used to create this simple jack stand using Fusion 360. The last time I featured the Firebird, I did a bit of work on the front suspension and installed the steering system. With that completed and functioning properly, the only things left to do now before taking this car out for a test drive is to install the motor and drivetrain and mount the top of the struts to the body. I started by assembling the motor mount and gear assembly. As I mentioned in the previous video, the shaft of the motor sits a bit too high in relation to the axle to simply run a drive shaft directly from the motor to the rear axle. So this setup will ensure that the drive shaft sits low and flat in the vehicle, and the slight gear reduction will also provide a bit more torque. I started by installing the pinion gear onto the motor, which I simply press fit onto the shaft, and after that I secured the motor to the motor mounting plate using two M1.6 machine screws. Next I installed the lower spur gear. Here I'm adjusting the position of the motor to ensure that there is a slight gap between the gears and that they can turn freely without any binding. And here's a look at the finished assembly. I made sure that the motor was operating smoothly and I applied a little bit of grease to the gears. Next, I wanted to install the socket for the drive shaft to connect to. Now I wanted to test fit the motor mount assembly onto the chassis. The only modification I needed to make to get it to fit was to remove some material from the factory transmission crossmember. I won't be utilizing this crossmember, but I'm going to keep it in place, so I only removed enough material so that there was sufficient clearance, but I did not remove it entirely. With the motor mount assembly able to sit how I want it, I marked the position of where I needed to drill the holes. To create the pilot holes, I held a pin over a flame for several seconds and pushed the hot pin through the plastic. Then I drilled the holes out to the correct size. Finally, I secured the motor mount to the chassis using two screws. I'm reusing a drive shaft that I had already, which is a tad bit too long for this car. This drive shaft uses a spring to apply outward pressure to each end, which helps keep it in place and makes it easy to remove. However, this drive shaft is quite worn, and I'm afraid that the two sections might slip, so I simply adjusted the drive shaft so that it was the correct length, with just a little bit of wiggle room for when the suspension moves up and down, and I glued the drive shaft at that length. And with that complete, the drivetrain is now fully installed. The motor sits back further than where it would be on a full-scale car. I did this because I wanted the motor to sit as low as possible and to ensure that it wouldn't collide with the steering linkage. I've tested the interior and ESC with the motor in this position, and although it's tight, everything fits well. With everything installed, I propped up the chassis and tested to ensure everything in the drivetrain and axle is functioning correctly. Unfortunately, there's a lot of wheel wobble. This is caused by the wheel hubs having some damage and being bent when I was using this axle on a drag car. The grippy tires and high torque motor took a toll on this axle's components. I've since redesigned the hubs and axle assembly, and I'm anticipating this new design will be able to handle the torque far better than this design. I will either be rebuilding or replacing the axle on this car, but for just some preliminary test drives, this axle in its current state will do just fine. I may also add a torque arm at some point to eliminate the axle twist. Next thing I did was install the struts. For now, I figured I'd just glue the upper strut mount to the underside of the body. This is just a temporary setup. I have a much better permanent plan in the works, but I just wanted to get this car to a state where I could do a quick test drive and see how well the struts would function. I did my best to make sure the struts were mounted symmetrically. After that, I cut the shafts and glued them to the knuckle. After that, I lubed the inside of the strut and mounted the body to the chassis piece. Like I said, this is just a temporary setup. I've got a better solution in the works, but with that installed, the car is now able to be driven. Even with the bad rear hubs, poorly positioned struts, and completely untuned suspension, I couldn't resist this opportunity to test out this car just to see if this crazy build will drive and maybe even drift. It turns out the car actually drives quite well. The motor provides lots of torque and plenty of speed, the steering felt accurate and responsive, and the handling seemed decent, all things considered. I'm very pleased with where the car is at right now. It's a blast to drive, and I think there is potential to make this into at least a somewhat decent drift car. Obviously, if all I cared about was drifting performance, I certainly wouldn't be messing around with a 124 scale Firebird model kit with a straight axle rear end, modified McPherson front suspension, and a linkage steering system. This build incorporates a balance of making the car look and function as similarly to the full-scale vehicle it's replicating as possible, while also making the performance as good as possible within those confines. With that said, I've identified a lot of things that I want to do that I believe will greatly improve this car's ability to drift. One thing that I was able to do during these tests was add a little bit of weight to different areas of the chassis and see how the car responded. This car only weighs a little under 4 ounces as is, and the weight is fairly evenly distributed throughout the car, so just placing a little bit of weight in the front or rear of the car had a dramatic effect on how it handles and drifts. There are 3 major things that I want to address moving forward on this car. The first is the motor mount. The design is fine, however, the heat from the motor has slightly deformed the motor mount to the point where the back of the motor is resting on the K-member. The solution for this is easy. I just need to remake this part using a more heat-resistant material. I'll start by printing in a more durable, heat-resistant resin. However, if that fails, I'll machine the part from aluminum. The other 2 things are going to be a little bit more involved. As I mentioned, I need to do some work on the axle. I had a lot of trouble getting the car to drift while filming, and I figured out that the rear diff is no longer locked. I'm currently in the process of prototyping some rear axle designs that will be made available for sale in the coming months as a part of the kit. So more than likely, I'll just be installing one of those axles into the car, rather than continuing to mess around with this one that's already in it. The last major thing is the suspension and structural rigidity of the chassis. The upper strut mount I'm going to be installing should help with the alignment and allow for a little bit of adjustability, which will definitely help. I also think I need to modify the struts a little to get some more travel, and I need to lower the rear end a bit since there's too much rake angle right now. I'm also going to address the chassis' flexibility by adding some reinforcement to stiffen it up. But so far so good, it's great to see this car driving, and I've got some more model car RC conversions in the works which I should be able to have some videos with these projects in the coming weeks. These projects are using chassis and components that will be made available for purchase in the near future. I'll have more information about these products in future videos. Also, while I'm on that topic, the Make It RC store is now open. Currently, there's only a few items available at this time, however, there will be more items added over these next few months. Last week I showed the design process I used to create this jack stand. I really like the design, though due to its small size, I wasn't able to make it functional. But with the more simplistic design of this jack stand, which uses just a pin to set the height, making a functional version of this in 1/24 scale will be far easier. Once again, I'm using Autodesk Fusion 360 to design the part, and the image over on the right as a reference. Designing this jack stand was even easier than the previous one I showed. The entire design process only took several minutes, and required only simple design techniques and commands, making this a great design project for any beginners. Although I'm designing this in 1/24 scale, I will probably scale this design up and print some 1/10 scale versions of it as well. One thing that I mentioned in the last video, and I'm once again keeping in mind here, is that I want to make sections of the design thicker than how they are in the full-size version that you see on the right, since if you scale down those exact measurements to 1/24 scale, the walls of the part would be very thin and therefore won't be able to support that much weight and will be much harder to print. So I want to make the design I'm creating a little bit thicker than what the full-size jack stand would be. I'm using a 1mm dowel pin to set the height. To make sure there's enough clearance for the pin to fit through, I'm making the holes 1.2mm in diameter. There are two things on this jack stand that I changed after designing what you see here. The first thing I did was make the part that slides up and down shorter. I ended up removing the bottom two holes so that the piece can sit much lower than what it would be if I left it how it is here, and I made the base a little bit thicker since I was having some trouble printing it with the base as I designed it initially. But really, it's just an all-around simple, straightforward design. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comment section below, and I will do my best to answer it. Both of these jack stands turned out great, and will make an awesome addition to the scale shop. Once again, before concluding this video, I want to showcase some of the amazing work that's been showcased over on the Make It RC Facebook group. I always enjoy seeing the awesome builds and projects you all have been posting. If you'd like to join this group, the link to the Make It RC Facebook page is below in the description. And that is all for this video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.